Here's an overview of where death counts are from SARS-CoV-2 virus, looked through data collection of up to 3 countries and some of the smaller super spreader events. My last update was done on April 24th. I've been updating since November 6th. My attempt here was to find the gap or bridge the gap between the two opposing scenarios or two opposing narratives on what is happening with SARS-CoV-2 in numbers. And I've left cases out completely out of the picture, and I've relied predominantly on death counts. So you'll see that in this bottom right corner where the fatalities are. So I'll be covering everything through the article. Then after that, I've also inserted the hospitalizations, which you'll see in the orange here. Then everyone who had symptoms of COVID. This is also something that can be fairly well documented. And then I've put in test positivity rate. Test positivity rate is, you can think of it of the border after which things get a bit unclear. And this, I believe, is the source of so much conflict, so much misunderstanding. Perhaps some people would claim source of so much manipulation in this entire picture. So, but in any case, I've included test positivity rate predominantly because this rate is being used in order to predict the percentages of fatalities. So fatalities are not gauged based on the totality numbers of people, but rather a test positivity rate, which right off the top puts us in a bit of a tricky situation, because if test positivity rate is not very clear, then fatality and what it means becomes more muddy in terms of where fatalities rates will be going. In any case, these are hard numbers for each of these factors that are contributing to SARS-CoV-2. This gap is what I will be exploring as I go through the entire posting here on the left. If we look at the total amount of people as 100%, hypothetically, all getting infected at the same time. These scenarios are, of course, never necessarily true, but what I wanted to explore is what would happen if it was such a super spreader event, and this ties into the narrative that is driving the lockdowns. One of the factors of driving of the lockdowns is precisely the idea that this virus is coming to get 100% of the people. So I wanted to look at that scenario. I will furthermore, rather than 100%, I also like to use the number 10,000, because 10,000 people is one city district. It would be a large neighborhood. So it's much easier for us to visualize numbers if they are within the vicinity of 1,000. So 1,000 people or 50,000 would be a good number, even 100,000. But as soon as we get into the number million or bigger than that, the brain makes it much harder to understand that. As I go along, I will be showing numbers of the people that approximately would have died or would have been impacted or hospitalized and so on, in comparison to a city district that you might be living in. So you can think of it as, this is what would happen if all of a sudden everybody caught the virus. So right off the top, one crucial element that is not discussed that contributes to the confusion is the concept of innate immunity. Now, these innate immunities can come in various different forms. For example, innate T-cell defense or immunity from prior coronaviruses. The claims of there being innate immunity where individuals may not even test positive at all because the virus would just never survive is the gap between the groups of people who think that this virus is seasonal like flu type of a virus, for which there's very much a lot of innate immunity already. I have assembled a listing a few different researchers that you can look up that calculate that innate T-cell and adaptive immunity is already contributing anywhere from 20, as you see here, to 60%. So the blue line really represents the amount of people that will simply never be affected by this entire thing at all. If that happens, that means that the test positivity rate would be that much smaller, because the blue line people will never test positively. So if we say that up to 60%, all the way down to here, of people were to beat the virus without any problems and not test positive, that means that only this area underneath would be the area that would be in the purple zone, which would be the test positivity rate. What is happening is that the driving narrative of lockdowns is claiming that the test positivity rate will keep climbing up and up and up and up and up and up until it hits 100%, in which case even a small percentage of 1 to 2% of test positivity rates would create lots of devastation worldwide. That is the narrative. And that, I haven't seen a lot of conversation about this specific topic. Basically, out of the 10,000 people in your neighborhood, anywhere between 2,000 and 6,000 individuals will be completely fine. Okay, so that's if 2,000 is actually not very large of a number. So hypothetically, the researchers that showed only 20% innate immunity would actually be used by the organizations that promote lockdowns to say, look, we're not very protected from it, which means that this line here will be around here. So we're looking at a test positivity rate that will climb as high as this, right? Whereas if it's 60%, it's as low as this. And that difference makes a huge difference in how policies could be made around this entire issue. So have that in mind. The healthier the nation is, and the more individuals can withstand the virus based on various factors and distances. I mean, that's all started with social distancing. The larger this innate immunity will be. And this does not include isolation, meaning individuals who are in the blue zone are not people who have managed to avoid getting the virus, but rather individuals who were exposed to the virus, including the vaccine in this case. So what the vaccine is trying to do is to push this with to contribute to the blue line. Of course, the big question in everyone's minds is whether having one variant virus vaccine being presented as the entire solution long term, whether that'll suffice in fighting broad range of variants that will come out of this. But so that's been another topics of conversation that I've heard people talk about and I have a lot of disagreement in. And of course, it would be great to get more and more research on specifically this topic. Unfortunately, the only way to pull off this kind of research would be to have about 10,000, let's say, volunteers that would choose to get all exposed to the SARS-CoV-2 and then see how everyone does. Let's keep moving. So test positivity rate, these are the numbers that have been collected to date. I've purposely chosen US and Italy because US and Italy are, especially specific towns in them, have done fairly badly in terms of impacts. The reason why I've put the range here is because certain cities such as New York City right here would have gotten much more hardly hit, and Italy had a similar thing, whereas Canada, by and large, there's a big difference in Canada between the East and the West Coast, but as an average, Canada, even with the East Coast doing fairly poorly, the West Coast would have brought the numbers down. It's just a matter of this having a slant as well, where it would end up higher one end if we were just to go deeper into this data. What I find interesting is the Diamond Princess data that came out right off the top, the entire pandemic. And in the meantime, there's another aircraft carrier, all of which I have listed underneath here, that have gathered very strict data. And now the main question remains whether indeed Diamond Princess in particular, because aircraft carriers have different areas and departments that don't necessarily mix and mingle with each other. Whereas Diamond Princess as a cruise ship would have had much more of a wider buffet-style socializing world. But the question remains whether this would have been a perfect petri dish. Either one of these would have been a perfect petri dish experiments or, let's say, research sources or data sources where we could make a claim such as that everyone who did not test positive would have by and large been okay. And this is that extrapolation moment where I believe those two doctors on the west coast of the US in California that spoke at the beginning of the pandemic, they were accused of extrapolating. So that's another domain of conversation that I've found a lot of disagreement between people around whether you're allowed to extrapolate or not. And of course, I've heard this argument on both ends. So the testing of the vaccine on, say, 50 people or 100 or 1,000 people is also an act of extrapolating in order to approve the vaccine. So the scientific process always works through extrapolations. What I find interesting is that both of these carriers haven't really crossed the line of 25%, which makes it here 74%, for Diamond Princess even a larger one, up to 80% of potential innate immunity that these passengers would have had on these ships. So basically, if you were to think about your neighborhood, if you lived in a US town, out of the 10,000 people in your neighborhood, anywhere between 174 to 930 people would have tested positive. So that means that the rest would have been, so over 9,000 people would have not tested positive, and good chances that these numbers would have made it into conversation. So this is where the test cases have been by and large measured and reported, and this is why a lot of people were thinking that the numbers were climbing very highly, because the test positivity rate in a community of 10,000 that would get a couple of hundred even test positive results could stir a lot of commotion, thinking that this virus is going to start spreading everywhere until it hits again 100% and gets everyone to test positive. Or it could be that this is the worst case scenario, especially since numbers continued to be consistent ever since many of the US states started reopening with less than 30% vaccination. From that angle, it would mean that up to 9.3%, right here outlined, is how much US or Italian town or a village would have gotten hit if everybody were to get this virus all at the same time. So that means the worst case scenario approximately currently looks like it would have been about up to 1,000 people. So that's kind of like a tenth. Another element to consider is that a lot of deaths in the flu world would usually get counted seasonally rather than cumulatively. We don't count how many people died out of flu in the entirety of the existence of flu. Certain organizations would count all of deaths from COVID, whereas some others would only include seasonal numbers. So out of the people who are tested positive, there's about 70% in the US amount of people who have symptoms, and in Canada it's been about 65. The US, Italy, and Canada seem to agree on the percentages of symptoms coming out to be between 60 and 70%. In the US, in the worst case scenario, again, out of 10,000 people, there would have been up to about 651 people who would have had symptoms in the community, and everyone else would not have symptoms. And those 651 up to, or 450 in Italy and about 130 in Canada would have actually been probably the main spreaders of this virus across the entire 100% until all the immune ones didn't feel it and not test positively. And then we come to hospitalizations, where it would be in the US about 100 people in the neighborhood would have gotten hospitalized. In Canada, it would have been about 20 people. So in your neighborhood, you would have heard of 20 people get hospitalized. I've drawn that, and as you can see, the numbers start getting much smaller in comparison to 100%. The issue with hospitalization is that hospitals are full through other adversities that happen to humans, and also they can't be kept empty all the time. So hospitals are consistently battling this futility that they need to be not too big to have too many empty beds and unused equipment, but big enough so that if there is waves that hit us, so that they withstand much better. Hospitalizations were one of the predominantly used drivers with politicians and media And it is hospitals that would have gotten overwhelmed, that would have made it into the news and media. So from hospitals that were starting to see large numbers and getting overflown, even if they're down here in 1% and would never cross over, according to even the aircraft carrier. If there was no immunity here, the hospitalization numbers would actually go much higher. They would come up to probably this point right here. And those are the projections that were really scaring the world by and large, especially because some of these scenarios to some degree happened where they have an overflow that they could not handle. A quick note on adverse effects. Most of the data collected for adversities is expressed as a percentage of the hospitalized, but this is not very precise because many people who are not hospitalized may have adverse reactions. Furthermore, we go now to mortality rates, and fatalities are the best descriptors of what would have happened because hospitalization symptoms and test positivity rates and also innate immunity are all subject to how well or not well any given data collection report or research was conducted. And with all the science at hand, this is sort of the picture with a lot of gaps between the two narratives that we've arrived at. But fatality tells a story. And in the case of the aircraft carrier that currently holds the highest number of test positivity rates, the aircraft carrier had a 0.02% fatality if you look at the difference between how many individuals were on that aircraft and how many people died. So if you're living in US town, the worst case scenario of everyone getting COVID in your neighborhood, you would have had about 19 people die, out of which 18 people would have been over 70 years old. There's research on many of these people having pre-existing conditions, which means that one person who's younger than 70 would have died in your neighborhood and all other neighborhoods. That one person that would have died would have made it to the news, likely. And nobody wants to have somebody who's in their 40s and 50s die. And as a result, these numbers, because life is very much valued in our modern world, casualties can very much be used, even if there's one death, to raise awareness and potentially raise panic. In Italy, there would have been 20 people in the neighborhood. Canada, that 6 people would have died. Notice here that pretty much every individual would have been above 70 years old. One way to think about the impact of this entire virus is to consider that there would have been no lockdown before this virus would have hit anywhere starting from November and December 2019 all the way up until mid-March, which is when most Western countries would have locked down. And by that time, the impact of how many people would have gotten exposed is exactly this gray zone right now. So the question is whether the virus would have had enough time to build it up to infect most of the people, which revealed itself in the way US and Italy revealed, because as certain US states have started opening up, their numbers have continued following the regular mathematical seasonal respiratory disease curves, which suggests also that most harshly hit US and Italian towns could represent the letting it rip hypothesis, rendering the numbers in the direction which is the ones that are collected, and that by and large the rest of the individuals would have been fine. This doesn't necessarily exclude the variants, of course. So we could draw a picture like this for every variant that comes, and that's where the numbers get additively worse and worse. A big part of the panic perhaps could also be from the fact that there's a lot of data that is coming out that is showing that if this virus happens to not be from nature but rather than leaked from a lab, then the panic also comes from the notion that we don't know whether indeed we by and large might not have immunity of this blue line. If that blue line is not there, then everyone would just keep getting it. And I think that was another very strong driving force to the panic. Again, countries like US and Italy, by and large, being open despite the lockdowns, because culturally many of these places would not have necessarily obliged in the way that the law does, the way they do in Canada, for example, or Sweden, where people are much more distant
and not as law and mandate breaking.
It makes US and Italian cities and places much better exemplars of what happens. Canada and US both shut down on pretty much the same date in mid-March.
But despite having quote-unquote lockdown at the same time, US saw its first wave take thousands of lives, whereas Canada's first wave had deaths that counted in the hundreds.
So the hypothetical worst-case scenario would be that if everyone got infected, taking into account some of these research papers that claim immunity, native immunity, which would not give any test positivity to these individuals, that the worst case scenario would be written as follows here, and that about in your neighborhood 280 people would die, and 7 to 14 people would be below the age of 70, which is by and large, according to our modern world, a large number of younger people dying from this one virus. All the fatalities for any community are in much larger numbers as well. So in your community, by and large, there's many individuals who are leaving us based on many other adversities other than this one. So this is where the concept of statistical significance versus societal significance comes into play.
This is not a scientific problem. It is a societal problem. We have to be careful not to mistake statistical significance with societal significance. It is not whether the data is statistically significant, as we can statistically narrow down anything we measure. The question we want to ask ourselves is whether our data is truly societally significant. Are the numbers important enough for society to make an ethical decision in favor of the data? Besides bare data, the world of ethics additionally includes forces of societal order, which are not about scientific data, but about what is the most important societal issue to deal with and prioritize. Just like in every trolley problem, humans are always stuck with having to compare data gathered on the account of different adverse effects any unexpected calamity brings upon members of society. Some examples are flu, cancer, heart attack, diabetes, suicide. It's not just COVID. But in the year 2020 and big part of 2021, COVID really took the cake. Plus, we have finally reached an age where we found a way to label every single human being as a minority. Of course, minority is the number in this case that represents the chance one might randomly be susceptible to a virus.
All the resources were by and large very much pushed into the world of COVID. So it was really big win for the industries that are wanting to save humanity from viruses. And I've put some extra information here on different kinds of modelings. I might do some more videos later. I hope this clarifies it to most people around why there's such opposing narratives. And this is a very good conversation to have.
Stay healthy, and this is the viewer taking a closer look.